Shalom and welcome to the Israel Policy Pod. I'm Neri Zilber, a journalist based in Tel Aviv and a policy advisor to Israel Policy Forum. Dr. Naysan Rafati is back with us this week to discuss all things Iran as the ceasefire talks between the U.S. and the Islamic Republic lurch from optimistic to pessimistic and back again at the speed of a Donald Trump tweet. Naysan is, of course, the senior Iran analyst at the International Crisis Group in Washington and was previously a postdoc fellow at the RAND Corporation, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the IFRI think tank in Paris. He also holds a doctorate from Oxford University and is an Arsenal Football Club fan, but we won't hold that against him. I wanted to get Naysan's take on the latest in the ceasefire talks and in the waters of the Persian Gulf. The question is always deal or no deal, or maybe something in between, as we discussed, and how the Iranian regime actually views the last 2 months of war and now non-war. At the end, we also delved into what's happening inside the Islamic Republic right now, politically and economically. This is shaping up to be a critical week in the war, and Naysan did a great job, as always, breaking it all down for us. But first, a few thoughts from me. So just FYI, we're recording this Monday afternoon Tel Aviv time in case, as is very likely, something happens between now and when this episode goes up. But in just a few hours, sirens will wail across Israel, not because of any incoming Iranian ballistic missile fire, but to mark the start of Memorial Day here, dedicated to the memory of all those fallen soldiers and civilian victims of terrorism who paid the ultimate price, including over the last 2.5 years of war since October 7th, 2023. As is customary here in Israel, tomorrow night, Tuesday night, is the start of Independence Day festivities. So there's major emotional whiplash every year to go from the sorrow of Memorial Day to the joy of Independence Day. But this is how Israel's founders designed it on purpose, to convey that very message from sorrow to joy, all in the span of really just a few hours. And this year, Israel, as we all know, turns 78 years young. I couldn't tell you what 76 and 77 were like the last 2 years. It was all a blur, honestly, and was superseded in many ways by not only October 7th and the ongoing wars, plural, but also the fate of the hostages, who were still, as we should all remember, being held in Gaza during those Independence Days. But I definitely remember number 75, Israel's 75th birthday, back in April of 2023. It was at the height of the mass demonstrations against the Netanyahu government and its attempt to overhaul and undermine Israel's judicial system and really Israel's democracy. A big demo was held that night, Independence Day Eve, on Kaplan Street in central Tel Aviv, probably over 150,000 people in attendance that night. Remarkable in retrospect, given the attrition and exhaustion of the Israeli public 3 years on, and with everything that has happened really in between. But that's the point, I think. Israel's 75th birthday was the first Independence Day under this latest far-right version of the Benjamin Netanyahu government. And this week will, number 78, will be the last, by definition, of this Netanyahu government, with elections expected likely in the fall and really likely in September of this year. As we've said many times on this podcast, because it happens to be true, this coming election later this year will prove existential for Israel and its future trajectory. By next Independence Day, number 79, we'll have a much better sense of where this country is actually heading, with the hope that the preceding 4 years were the darkest darkness before a new dawn breaks. All right, with that, let's talk Iran with Naysan Rafati. Hi, Naysan. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Neri. It's good to be back.
It's good to have you back, Naysan. A lot has transpired in the world, but especially in your patch of the world since we last spoke in January. That was in the midst of the mass protests that engulfed Iran. Donald Trump back then put down the marker for what would eventually escalate into all-out war. saying he would come to the rescue of the Iranian people. That is debatable, whether that has actually transpired since then. The regime also, as you laid out for us back then, wasn't really capable of finding an exit ramp, not from its own domestic troubles, and certainly not from the head-on collision that would eventually transpire with the United States and Israel. So here we are, nearly 4 months later. So I wanted to start with the most immediate question, Naysan, and that's where we are with the talks currently ongoing between the U.S. and Iran. The ceasefire is nearly 2 weeks old. The deadline is coming up this Wednesday. So we're a bit of hostage to fortune and to Trump tweets, with things moving very quickly, even on a kind of minute-by-minute and hourly basis. But give us a sense, if you could, of where we are as we record this episode Monday afternoon Tel Aviv time. It wasn't a great weekend, was it, in terms of the prospect of actually getting a permanent ceasefire deal?
No, I think you could look at it and say that, from the end of February, we had several weeks where we had the fog of war. And for the last 2 weeks or so, we've been in the haze of a ceasefire whose terms are not entirely clear unless they're being breached, and negotiations that may or may not be happening with a supreme leader in Iran who may or may not be alive. And you're right. I mean, we are recording on Monday, but to give your listeners, watchers, a sense of how fast some of these things have been moving, it was 2 weeks ago or so when President Trump started off the day by threatening that the end of Iranian civilization may be nigh. And by the end of the day had announced a ceasefire agreement of 2 weeks through Pakistani mediation. And about 100 hours later, we had the highest in-person negotiations between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran since the revolution, led by Vice President J.D. Vance on the U.S. side and Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, on the other side. So, throughout these 2 weeks, there have been back-channel contacts and a group of mediators led by Pakistan trying to see whether or not, minimum, this ceasefire can be extended, and at most whether Washington and Tehran can make their way to some kind of memorandum of understanding, some kind of deal. And it is poised. As we're speaking, the U.S. delegation is in the air. The Iranians may or may not be joining them for talks that could, at least theoretically, resume in Islamabad tomorrow.
Finally poised, as they like to say, but as you mentioned earlier, things are not at all clear about the prospects of getting a deal or not. We'll get into the various minutiae and the various scenarios in just a moment. Over the past 2 weeks, mistakes have been made by both sides, one side in particular, one side more than the other, in terms of how we've gotten to the point now. And again, we're speaking Monday afternoon Tel Aviv time, where I think it's maybe a 50-50 chance whether there's a deal or potential reignition of the war, escalation, and a pretty bad escalation potentially.
And an in-between where you have a continued muddle of a ceasefire. So big picture, since the ceasefire took effect, the U.S. has stopped bombing Iran. Iran has largely stopped bombing Israel and Gulf states. That was essentially the tenor of hostilities from the end of February, when Israel and the U.S. started Operation Epic Fury / Roaring Lion. Iran retaliating by attacking shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran also retaliating with missile and drone strikes against Israel, as well as missile and drone strikes against U.S. allies in the Gulf. So that major element of armed hostilities has ebbed, and we've seen, a bit of a quieting on all fronts, a bit of a muzzling of guns, but a lot of uncertainty and contradiction around that. So, for example, the Iranians, who had, shut down the Strait of Hormuz by menacing traffic going through there. For the first several weeks, the U.S. had actually issued a sanctions waiver that allowed Iranian oil to continue going through the Gulf.
Remarkable.
And then President Trump essentially flipped an Uno card and said, we're going to introduce a blockade of Iranian oil. So if the Iranians aren't going to let other people's ships go through, the U.S. will assemble more than a dozen warships in the Gulf of Oman to basically set up a blockade net, preventing Iranian exports from coming out and Iranian exports from going into Iranian ports. Over the weekend, the Iranians suggested that they could go back to limited opening of the Strait of Hormuz for commercial traffic. President Trump said, that's great, but we're still not going to let your ships go through. The Iranians then resumed firing at a couple of vessels over the weekend, right. And the U.S. In turn shot and boarded an Iranian vessel that was trying to breach the U.S. Blockade. So a lot of these things on the fringes of this ceasefire are fraying, and we've seen again, President Trump moot the possibility of resuming strikes that would go up the escalation ladder relative to where hostilities froze off by, attacking Iranian power production sites and bridges and, moving into an infrastructure stage. So we're in a position where, there's a lot of jockeying for position. Both sides, I think, it's not their ideal to go back into hostilities because they know that entails a lot of risks. But between a ceasefire and an MOU, there are compromises that would have to be made, and happening in very murky scenarios where things are being done either through mediators or pronouncements via tweets, which is not usually how clarities are obtained, but rather leaves a lot of room for miscommunication, miscalculation, and misunderstanding.
And it is remarkable that, by the way, it's not just the U.S. president, but also many Iranian officials that are reacting via Twitter and other kind of public comments, trying to jockey for position at the negotiating table, and sometimes even in the Gulf itself, while diplomacy is happening behind the scenes. So there's rhetorical escalations, slight actual military escalations, all the while they're still negotiating, I assume, because it hasn't broken off yet. Emphasis on yet.
Yeah, I think if you have the misfortune of having to track all of the readouts that come from various foreign ministries. I mean, there are 4 countries that now have, in among diplomatic circles, managed to earn their own acronym, which is the STEP countries: the Saudis, the Turks, the Pakistanis. Egyptians, yeah, all of whom are in touch with the U.S. team, with the Iranian team, but really in terms of in-person negotiations, we've had pre-war negotiations, 2 sets of them between the Trump administration and Iran in 2025 and early 2026, and now the possibility of another round in Islamabad, following up on the one about 10 days ago.
Right. So that's where we are at the moment as we speak. And again, our listeners and viewers may be smarter than we are. If things go, pear-shaped by the time this episode goes up. But I wanted to get into the various scenarios that you touched on, Naysan. And let's start with a little game we've played here on this podcast way too often. And that's called Deal or No Deal. Trademark pending on that title. So, basically, what do you think a deal could look like between the U.S. and Iran? What would be the consequences of no deal? Again, potentially in the coming days if things do go pear-shaped. And as you kind of alluded to, is there some kind of halfway house zombie-like measure, right? No deal, but no non-deal that just kind of extends the current ceasefire indefinitely. Give us a sense of those 3 scenarios, what they could look like.
So I've had the pleasure of being on the pod a couple of times. We've talked about various rounds of U.S.-Iran negotiations. So people who have tuned into those will know that there's certain elements that will be very, very familiar, and there are certain elements that will be a bit different than what we've had in the past, and different circumstances, not just different factors. So the Trump administration in its second term has done kind of 3 sets of talks with the Iranians. The first set was in March, April of last year, prior to, or April, May last year, prior to the start of the 12-day war. And at the time, it was Iran's nuclear program was expanding. Iran was building up fissile material, especially at 60%. That was the focus of the negotiations, and U.S. sanctions relief was on the other side of the table. Those talks were largely moot after the start of the 12-day war, but it also introduced a new nuclear reality where Iran is not enriching. Involuntarily, as far as we know, since the June war, Iran's enrichment has been at zero.
Right.
It also still has fissile material that is presumed to be inaccessible, but at least 2 sites in Iran that were bombed by the U.S. in Operation Midnight Hammer. So when we had the second set of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, and you mentioned the protests, the protests that happened beginning of late December through January. The Trump administration came in and talked about that for Iranians to kind of seize this opportunity and topple the government, and the U.S. began to move in significant military assets, and there was again a pivot to talks over the remnants of Iran's nuclear program, right? What, like this fissile material that is still there, and again some element of sanctions relief. And now we're in the third set of negotiations where those nuclear elements are all still there, as is a new issue, which is the future of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. Mm-hmm. So you have a combination of things that are fairly consistent, and then you have an introduction of some new factors. Now, at its most sweeping, the U.S. would be looking at 4 kind of broad themes of Iranian concessions: nuclear, proxies, missiles, Hormuz. And it seems from the reporting around the negotiations that there's really been a triage of the nuclear piece of the puzzle and the Hormuz piece of the puzzle. So if you want to get into the nuclear side of what it looks like, there are 2 fundamental elements. I mean, there are other elements, but there are 2 main ones. Mm-hmm. One is what's happening with Iran's fissile material.
These are the 440 kilos buried somewhere in various sites inside Iran.
These include the 440 kilos, but there's a much bigger stockpile at 5% and 20%. Our concern is always with the 60% because that is the closest to weapons grade. But there's if you're approaching it as a problem set, the HEU, the highly enriched uranium, is the most concerning, but there are also larger stockpiles of 20 and 5%, which if Iran were enriching could also be enriched to 60 or 90%. So that's the status of the fissile material. So basically dealing with the big question mark on Iran's current program, and then negotiating over the future of Iran's nuclear program. So with each of these issues, whether it's the fissile material or it's the future trajectory of Iran's nuclear program, you have a finite number of options that produce an almost infinite number of combinations for an agreement, right? So on the fissile material, you have a finite set of things that you can do with them. You can keep bombing them and hope that aerial surveillance gives you enough of a sense of where the Iranians are moving these, if they're attempting to move them, and where they are, and hope that they just don't ever have an opportunity to access them. A second option is to get the Iranians to dilute them, to recover the 60% and dilute it down. Mm-hmm. Move it away from weapons grade to whatever level you want to decide. And the third option is to exfiltrate the material, right? So this can be done either through a ground operation where U.S. forces or U.S. and/or Israeli forces go in, physically try to seize this material, which is obviously a fairly complicated operation, or you get the Iranians to send it out to, Russia's proposed itself as a recipient. You have, fuel banks, you have the U.S., you have other places where it can go. Mm-hmm. And you have a combination of all of these things, right? So Iran dilutes part of its stockpile, so it says it's not giving up the entirety of it, and it ships out another part of the stockpile, so the U.S. can say it shipped out some of the material, right? So all of these combinations um, uh, can be moved around to come up with some kind of compromise. And the same thing is true with regards to the future trajectory. So the U.S. Aspirational line is Iran agreeing to zero enrichment forever. Dismantle the program, give up domestic enrichment. If you want to work with the U.S. on nuclear civil cooperation, that's fine, but no enrichment on Iranian soil. The Iranians will always insist that they have the right to enrich, even though they are physically not able to carry that out in practice right now because their enrichment facilities are non-operational. So then you get into a similar debate. Is it zero or is it limited? Is it zero for a while, then limited, or is it limited and then phased out to zero? If you can't agree, if the U.S. doesn't agree to a limited program and the Iranians don't agree to a perpetually kneecapped program, then are there permutations in between where you say for X years we do this, or for X years we do X, and then for X years we do Y? All of these things can get you towards a non-proliferation objective, which is having eyes on Iran's fissile material and ensuring that for as long as you can, that program is as constrained as you can make it so that it's not a proliferation threat.
And just to be clear, in terms of a potential deal, and specifically on the nuclear issue, the prior Trump position was quite maximalist, shall we say? Zero enrichment, give up, what does Donald Trump call it? Your nuclear dust, the highly enriched uranium. So that was at least the prior, potentially current American position. But like you said, according to reporting, maybe there is some flexibility there in terms of the Americans.
And that's not just consistent with his second term, but also with his first term.
Maximalist.
From the time of the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear agreement in May of 2018, the U.S. position under President Trump's first term was zero enrichment for Iran. And over the course of the 2025 negotiations and the 2026 negotiations, this has remained one of the fundamental dividing points between the two sides, is that the U.S., at least in its public posturing, maintains that position. As you said, there's been reporting that suggests there may be a little bit more wiggle room in terms of prolonged cessations and then leading to some kind of other arrangement. Again, I think we're dealing with a different reality that even the Iranians right now, per this same reporting, are conceding on the notion of a moratorium, and they're debating over how long that would actually be. Because again, for the first time in 20 odd years of the Iran nuclear crisis, the US actually has Iran where it wants it to be, which is at zero enrichment. So the point is, how do you extend that for as long as possible while having verification and handling the nuclear dust, the fissile material, to your satisfaction? So conceptually, all of these circles can be squared. If the reporting is accurate that the Iranians have come back with 5% and the US is asking for 20%, that doesn't fill in a lot of details, right? There are a lot of other things that would have to go into this.
You mean 5 years and 20 years?
For a moratorium,
yeah.
Now, again, like there's a reason the JCPOA was 150 odd pages, is that it also got into a lot of other granularities that would have to be addressed. And at this point, all of these discussions around Islamabad, success right now would look like a memorandum of understanding, a 2 or 3 page document with bullet point understandings that that both sides are like, okay, we've got a deal. Now let's fill in the parameters. And there's going to be questions about what are the inspection mechanisms that go into place? How quickly does the IAEA go in? Who gets the fissile material out? Does an agreement account for Iranian demands on research and development? Would it have any centrifuges left? Like, there are a lot of finer details that would have to be hammered out with experts. But the big picture would be enrichment, handle the fissile material, and then handle the future trajectory.
Right. But it does sound like what's the the joke. I think it's like a Churchill joke, right? We're now just haggling over the price. If the Trump people have actually come down from their very maximalist demands of 0, nothing at all, to various permutations of, I guess, not allowing Iran perhaps to enrich, but some moratorium for X number of years, some dilution of the fissile material that's already enriched. It's interesting. We'll see if Donald Trump agrees to be flexible. I suppose the Iranians also need to be flexible, including, by the way, the second issue you mentioned, which is the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. I assume that's more of a binary choice, right? 0-1, to return it to the pre-war situation where it was open and the Iranians were not, holding the global economy hostage.
Yeah, Hormuz is. First, on just to close off on the first point. I mean, President Trump, after the reports of 20 years came out, also said that he didn't really like the idea.
Right.
So whether that means he doesn't like the idea, but he would accept it or accept a variant thereof, remains to be seen. And whether or not the Iranians would accept a moratorium in practice that goes into several years, maybe a decade, maybe more, again, remains to be seen. There's a flip side to that whole debate as well, which is what the Iranians expect in return for nuclear steps, which is sanctions relief. And again, there's different types of sanctions relief. There's Iran being able to access some of these blocked financial assets that it has dotted around the world. That would be one form of financial relief. Another form of financial relief would be a lifting or waiving of primary or secondary sanctions that the U.S. has in place. So again, all of these things I was saying before, there are a finite number of possibilities for how you address each of them. But when you take the nuclear on fissile material, and then you take the nuclear on future trajectory, and then you take sanctions relief, you do have an infinite number of combinations, because there's zero trust between these two sides, right? So none of this all happens by magic. The U.S. will say, well, we need to get the fissile material addressed before we let you have any funds. And the Iranians would say, well, we need a gesture of your good faith, then you have to let us do X, and then we'll do X in return, right? Like you have a lot of sequencing, scope and sequencing, and are all, how these negotiations typically go, and where you get into a lot of the debates. And I remember in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, when the Biden administration was negotiating a return to JCPOA, we had gotten to the point where they were litigating over some of the footnotes, and it still broke down. So these are things that the draft text of the agreement that the Biden administration and European and allies and P5+1 partners were negotiating with Iran in 2022 actually had on the top of the draft printout, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so if you take that, I mean, we're discussing, 5 versus 20. I mean, there's a very big difference between 5 and 20, right? So, there can be movement, but a lot of these things actually need to be signed off, and even then need to be implemented. On Hormuz, look, the Iranians have discovered this tool that they had never really, they threatened to use before, but turned out to be fairly, and then we've seen some of the reporting over the weekend that, President Trump was a bit surprised that, a couple of drones are enough to put shipping companies, off the notion of transiting through a dodgy strait. There is some precedent for this, because we saw it with the Houthi campaign in the Bab el-Mandeb last year, where they again were able to menace shipping and stop a lot of the traffic flowing through the Red Sea. So I think the interesting thing is that for the first couple of weeks, the Iranians were able to keep sending their stuff out. And the waiver was actually in place to facilitate that. And basically by putting the blockade in place and taking away the waiver, the U.S. basically said, if you're going to try to kill off traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, we're going to make sure that it's a murder-suicide for you. That, others may not be able to access oil exports or LNG or fertilizer and everything else that goes through the Gulf, but Iran will, see its seaborne trade ground to a halt. Now, whether or not the Iranians actually are willing to go back to a status quo ante is to be determined. They, want to get some residual benefit out of this. That goes against what the U.S. wants. That goes against the principle of freedom of navigation. That goes against everything the Gulf countries want. They don't want the Islamic Republic of Iran to essentially have a critical strait where the UAE and Qatar export LNG. Several Gulf countries export fertilizer. A lot of Gulf countries export crude oil. They do not want that to be subject to an Iranian sword of Damocles.
Yeah, the Ayatollah Road.
The Ayatollah booth, I think.
Booth. Yes, that's right.
Israel Policy Forum is a policy organization rooted in the Jewish community. Our mission is to build support for a secure, Jewish, democratic Israel through a viable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, advancing pragmatic U.S. policy towards the conflict, U.S.-Israel relations, and regional diplomacy among policymakers and community leaders. We promote policy measures endorsed by credible security experts, develop analysis and commentary, and convene programs that engage and educate leaders across the political, denominational, and generational spectrums. Our Young Professionals Initiative, IPF at Teen, works to elevate the discourse among next-generation leaders by building community and facilitating engaging programs related to Israeli-Palestinian affairs. To learn more about our work, visit us online at israelpolicyforum.org and follow us on social media. If you rely on Israel Policy Forum for credible and nuanced analysis, please make a tax-deductible gift today at ipf.li/supportthepod or at the Support the Show link in the show notes.
So that's kind of the negotiations, the very complicated negotiations that will need to take place, arguably to get to a deal. What's the scenario in terms of no deal? Talks break down, could happen even tonight, tomorrow, coming days. What do you expect will happen then?
So we have these three options, right? That Islamabad comes together and an MOU by magic actually addresses everything sooner rather than later, and we start to focus on implementation. So that's one scenario.
Why are you so pessimistic for a Middle East analyst? I don't understand where all this pessimism is coming from.
Yeah, I've generally learned to assume the worst and hope for the best, and you'll never be disappointed.
Right.
I know you will tease me at some point about being an Arsenal fan, so that applies equally to being an Arsenal fan. So that's one option, is that we get the miracle of Islamabad and we have a Ghalibaf and Arakchi and the rest of the Iranian team decide to go meet with the US, are able to bridge these remaining gaps or punt on some of the issues, right? So, the US, we talked earlier on, one of the things that we're looking at was restrictions on Iran's missile capacity, both in terms of the size of the arsenal and also potential limitations on the range of the arsenal. That seems to have essentially been punted for the time being, and we saw some reporting a week or two ago that in the U.S. 15-point proposal, this was essentially left as a to be determined kind of question, right? So, and that's fair enough. The Iranians it's going to be very difficult to get them to agree on anything related to missiles. So if you're triaging your central concerns, nuclear and Hormuz,
and by the way, also no real kind of public discussion about the proxies either. That also seems to be a climb down from the previous negotiating position of the Trump administration.
Yes, although again, I think that there are, if a deal is finessed into a kind of wider regional de-escalation, right, where you have now this process going on between the Israelis and the Lebanese. The Houthis have held fire throughout this, and then the U.S.-Iran, the Israel-Iran ceasefire kind of takes an effect. The proxies would be disengaged, right, and that's a starting point. Funding and things like that I mean, the first issue is, whether or not the Iranians would ever accept any of this stuff when it's such a core element in their national security doctrine. But secondly, how you enforce it, right? Like with nuclear, you have inspectors, you have quantities, and when it comes to proxies, let's take Hezbollah as an example. The Iranians, as you know, because you reported on this stuff, it's a bit of a challenge for them right now to send military supplies. Right, the land bridge through Syria is gone. So they, the stuff that you've covered in terms of Iran sending suitcases laden with GPS devices that can turn rockets into guided munitions, like those halcyon days for the Iranians seem to have passed to a certain extent. But if Iran says, the south of Lebanon has been destroyed, we're going to send some funds for reconstruction to our Shiite brethren and things like that, there again, is that a supporting a proxy, or is it something that might be less intolerable?
Right. So wait, we're getting on the no deal scenario.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So these are the parameters for
the magic of Islamabad.
An Islamabad miracle, where things actually fall into place. Then you've got essentially an extension of where we've been the last 2 weeks, which is that there's enough understandings and to basically everyone's kind of holding fire. Maybe there's some understandings that the Iranians let commercial traffic back through, and the Americans kind of ease the blockade or allow for tankers to go into Iran but not leave Iran. Some kind of working around the margins, but bottom line, you don't have an active return to hostilities. You don't have an active resumption of U.S. airstrikes against Iran. Iran does not attack Israel. Iran does not attack the Gulf. And you kind of keep this process open because A, there's enough progress for there to be light at the end of the tunnel, and B, the pain of watching the tunnel collapse is mutually shared by everyone. So there's no desire to go into something that's going to lead to a spike in oil prices, going to lead to further attacks on Iran, further fire on the Gulf. So everyone kind of decides on a muddle through approach, and we carry on kind of where we've been the last 2 weeks, where it's not hostilities, it's not peace. Iran's economy is continuing to be squeezed through sanctions. But no one really has an interest in going back and restarting the war. And then you have the third option, which is going back to essentially what we had, or picking up from where we were before the ceasefire, where we know that Iran still has drones, still has missiles, was able to maintain a certain rate of fire throughout the 5-6 weeks of conflict. And we know that President Trump has laid out exactly what the U.S. target package might be if that happens, which is, going after Iranian infrastructure, power plants, bridges, and so on. And you can add to that the asterisks of a potential military operation to retrieve the fissile material, because that will remain a consideration. So again, it's
pretty unlikely, but potential.
I mean, it's high risk for sure. I've gotten out of the business of saying that anything is unlikely at this point. But I think and we've seen Israel's defense minister also point out the other day that having some kind of resolution to that fissile material is a objective without which this campaign cannot end.
Well, the Israeli defense minister says a lot of things on a near daily basis. Let's leave it at that.
Okay. So we get into a scenario where we essentially pick up from where we left off. Prior to the ceasefire, the U.S. still has targets. The Israelis still have targets. There are both in terms of military assets, critical infrastructure, and perhaps personnel. The Israelis started this campaign by going after the supreme leader and later took out the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, Ali Larijani, and other high-ranking officials in the Revolutionary Guard, naval officials, Basij officials, intelligence ministry people. So all of that could essentially continue from where everyone left off, and the Iranians could go back to striking ships, striking U.S. bases in the region, striking U.S. allies in the Gulf. And again, I think from the U.S. perspective, everyone's talked about this, escalate to de-escalate. And so far we've gotten a lot of the escalate, a little bit of the de-escalate, but that cycle could be upon us again.
And just to touch on this issue of escalating to de-escalate, is there a pain point or a pressure point at which the Iranians may change their tune?
Look, the Iranians are under, I think, several different points of pain, right? I mean, leadership is one, right? Like they have lost some senior officials. You've got this kind of, I'm not sure team of rivals is the right phrase, but you've got these ascendant figures like Ghalibaf, who's kind of a person that straddles the political and IRGC elements of the system. You've got more hardline figures from the IRGC who are taking on positions in the National Security Council and all the rest of it.
You have a zombie supreme leader that has yet been seen in public.
We have a zombie supreme leader who has not yet been seen in public. That's also true. But look, if you want to understand the points of pain for the Iranian system, part of it is appreciating how difficult the situation was before the war started, right? So on the one hand, they're dealing with an economy that was in very rough shape even before the war, right? Part of the reason that the protests started at the end of December was that the currency was basically, falling apart. Inflation was 40+%. You had regular problems with, power outages and flooding and like a creaking national infrastructure. That was all before the war.
Right.
And you also had this massive gap between state and society that once those protests started over economic grievances quickly kind of escalated into a very widespread anti-regime uprising that the system put down with absolute violence and brutality.
Right.
So they are, even before the war, they were dealing with these, two major challenges. One, a economy and national infrastructure that was in rough shape, and the other one, the fact that a lot of Iranians, now I can't give you a percentage because these things are very difficult to ascertain, but a lot of Iranians who are just, and we've seen this not just with the 2026 protests, but the Masa Amini protests in 2022 and going back, that there are a lot of these grievances against the government, whether it's over political rights, social freedoms, economic malaise. That's the situation into which they started this war, and a lot of those problems are now worse off, especially when it comes to the economy. I mean, the internet has been out for weeks, essentially since the start of the war. That has a social impact, obviously. It makes it much more difficult for anyone outside to see what's going on in the country. It has an economic impact because there are a lot of small businesses that sell off of Instagram and Telegram and all of these other channels. Trade right now is going to be depressed because of the blockade. The infrastructure damage will run into the tens of billions, and all of those things, in a sense, the state will face a lot of challenges that it's papering over during the war as soon as the war is over. And that's going to be partly economic and partly it's going to be, society, like social and political.
Okay. So, I mean, the logical next question is, all that being equal, all that being true, doesn't the current Iranian leadership, the same regime, but this new Iranian leadership, quote unquote, understand that?
Look, I think this is why they're in Islamabad, right? Or why they've agreed to these ceasefires. They know that there is a financial imperative. They know that they are militarily mismatched, but there are also certain things that they will not capitulate on, right? And I think if there's an so part of it is getting the right terms, right? And I think part of the negotiating team's position is that we'll talk about enrichment, but we won't give up everything in one go. We want sanctions, but we want it to be sanctions lifting, but we want it to be maximized. We may discuss Hormuz, so they know that. I mean, there is an imperative for them to come to the table. The question is, I remember there was a quote before the war actually started where the U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff said that the president asked me, why haven't the Iranians capitulated?
Yeah.
And the Iranians will concede, but especially with the guys that are in charge right now, capitulation is going too far. They don't believe that they are a defeated party. They believe that they still have cards that they can play. They believe that if they capitulate on one point, it will invite further capitulations, and the U.S., because in their view it cannot be trusted. If you agree on one, they'll ask for two, and even if you agree on two, they'll ask for three. And then I think there's also an element of hardline doctrine, which is that they believe there's some within the system who think that agreeing to a ceasefire in June was a mistake, right? Because Iran basically looked for an off-ramp and in the process made a resumption of hostilities inevitable, right? That it should have pushed a little bit longer, because in this narrative, right, and we can debate how accurate it is, it was Iran's ability to absorb pain and carry on a battle of attrition that is its calling card.
Right.
So in their approach, it's not just getting the sanctions relief dividends and getting a ceasefire. It's changing the strategic equation so that the U.S. and or Israel will not do another mowing of the lawn in 6 months or a year. That's how they're approaching it. That if we're going to get terms, it has to be such that our adversaries are deterred from striking us again.
So to leverage this war, and arguably the last war, into something more beneficial to them strategically, economically, however you want to define it, moving forward, and not just kind of cutting their losses right now. So basically pulling both the US, Israel, the Gulf, maybe the global economy further into the abyss, because they think they have a better ability to absorb the pain.
I think among some in the system, that's probably where they're coming from. So it's not just a question of getting a deal that gets you out of the binds you're in right now, but kind of ensuring that over the longer term, this Hormuz is now one form of deterrent that they've realized that they now have. It was always a conceptual kind of deterrent. I was always a bit skeptical that they'd be able to pull it off very successfully, especially because of the murder-suicide scenario. But as it happened, the murder-suicide scenario kind of happened 5-6 weeks in rather than at the start. And that gave them a bit of a certain degree of proof of concept, I suppose.
Right. And we can also, this will be debated by military historians in the future, whether CENTCOM was in fact ready for that scenario.
I think they were ready, because CENTCOM has planned. I mean, the notion of Iran shutting down the Strait of Hormuz was never not considered.
Sure.
But I think there was, again, from the accumulated reporting over the past kind of month or two on the decision to go to war, I think there are suggestions that the U.S. also expected the Iranians to fold sooner rather than later, before this actually became a factor in the conversation.
Yeah, that was one scenario. I don't think the Americans fully expected the attacks on the Gulf and the impact on the Gulf itself. I think that also took them by surprise. Naysan, I mean, you kind of answered the question, but I want to pose it in more of a kind of immediate term context. Let's say there's a no deal, but not a return to full-scale open fighting. This kind of Twilight Zone zombie scenario muddling through. Who does that better serve in the immediate term? Is it the Iranians who is like, all right, well, the global economy will keep taking hits. The Americans are burning billions, keeping the beautiful armada just outside the Gulf? Or will the Iranians actually take a bigger hit now that potentially, ostensibly, there's a blockade even on their own oil?
I mean, to the extent that living to fight another day is a win. There are downsides and upsides for everyone here. I mean, unless there's resolution on the Strait of Hormuz, oil and gas prices will remain elevated beyond what they otherwise might be. They're going to continue to be disruptions, and I mean the knock-on effects of this de facto, all-in closure are substantial, right? I mean, everyone focuses on gas prices, and there's good reason for that, But we've done some work at Crisis Group on some of the the impacts in terms of things like fertilizer, where countries like Sudan get 52%, if I'm not mistaken, of their fertilizer through the Gulf. And so when you get into planting season, this becomes a serious problem. So, because the Gulf is so central to energy, but also non-energy trade, this is not a good situation. It's a situation where could be worse with active return to hostilities and active firing at ships, but it's not a great place to be. And the Iranians, and also for Israel and the U.S., there's another downside, which is that Iran may use a period of ceasefire to go after some of the entombed, missile launch sites and things like that. For the Iranians, the opposite is also true. The U.S. now has 3 aircraft carriers in the region. Additional troops continue coming into the region. Iran continues to be under economic fury sanctions, which is the newly branded revision of maximum pressure.
Okay.
Economic fury to complement epic fury.
Right.
Their shipments inbound are going to be curtailed. So again, the Iranians deal with limited trade, continued economic pressure. The rest of the world lives with a risk embellishment to prices on energy and gas. Everything is subject to a tweet or a misunderstanding where suddenly traders decide to go up and down based on the vibes of what a tweet suggests.
Don't we know it?
Yeah. So all of that stuff and, the fundamentals on the nuclear program and things like that are still kind of up in the air. So, is that better than, bombs falling and you having to go to shelter and Iranians losing, power because plants are attacked and U.S. ships coming under attack? I mean, yes. Is it the ideal scenario? Not quite. But you can see an argument being made that, the fact is that, Iran is now under the truest form of maximum pressure, right? That this is really the peak leverage that you can have. And that if you just leave it, the Iranian system will move towards a kind of failed state scenario because goods are not coming in or going out. Financial sanctions are at their peak. The government's, dealing with an uncertain leadership, and that maybe this is the time that where finally this system kind of implodes from within. The Iranians have also shown a significant, capacity for the absorption of pain. So, and they are also able to, continue inflicting it. And the phrase, mutually assured economic disruption, it comes to mind. Like, nobody's really destroying it, but it's putting enough of a press here, in terms of gas prices, elsewhere in the world for everything from fertilizer to
inflation,
helium, yeah, inflation, and I mean, in Iran, inflation is going to skyrocket, and some of the estimates that are coming out from either Iranian financial press or international organizations like the IMF and UNDP, like, Iran is, if and when it comes out of this, is going to be dealing with very high inflation, currency volatility that it's already had. And I think the IMF estimate was something like negative 6% GDP growth. And that's even without having gotten to the stage where potential US attacks against critical infrastructure could complement, previous Israeli strikes on a couple of their major gas fields and things like that, on top of an economy that was already running on a certain degree of fumes. So that's the kind of muddle through scenario. It's kind of where we've been the last 2 weeks, where the two sides don't really have a massive interest in trying to. They know that a return to hostilities carries a lot of problems, but getting to an MOU also might require compromises. So if you don't want that, you kind of continue where we've been with these kind of second tier violations and misunderstandings and jockeying for leverage and position, but not going back to a scenario of full out hostilities.
Jockeying for leverage and position vis-a-vis the negotiating table. So remains to be seen whether that actually succeeds. And this scenario you were just laying out, kind of, this is like the peak maximum pressure on Iran after 5.5 weeks of heavy war, now naval blockade, but no deal, right? And most importantly for some here in Israel and some kind of Iran hawks in Washington, no sanctions relief as part of an overall agreement with Iran. And yet, right, there's no resolution to the big fissile material stockpile. And there's no resolution, first and foremost, to Hormuz.
That's right. I mean, look, there's, I think whether you're in Tehran or whether you're in DC, there's going to be a constituency that wants everything and wants to give up nothing, right? That's pretty normal. There are going to be Iranians who will make the same argument on the other side that say, we can inflict more pain on the Americans. They need to accept minimal, some degree of enrichment, and we demand not just assets but primary and secondary sanctions relief. We want it all. We want to give up nothing. So there is that side of it as well. And you're right. Here in the U.S., there will be those who say, even zero enrichment isn't enough. There has to be missile restrictions, and even if Iran agrees to missile restrictions, there have to be proxy limitations. And if there are proxy limitations, all of that should be for minimal sanctions relief, if at all. And if you don't get that, then the coercive tools are still available. Let Iran, continue being under financial pressure, and we can, bomb the fissile material if we see satellite imagery suggesting that they're trying to access it, and that is, in the view of some, a reasonable alternative.
Yeah, in the view of many here in Israel, I've heard it myself that they prefer no deal over a deal whose contours we discussed at the top of the episode, which would not only have some kind of time limitation on whatever nuclear work, I guess in terms of enrichment, but also sanctions relief. And that runs directly against the idea that you've heard here now for many weeks after the regime remained intact. Regime change did not happen, despite certain promises made by certain people at the very beginning of the war that it would happen. That, in 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, the end of the regime it's almost inevitable coming out of this war. Maybe, maybe, but with actual economic sustenance and sanctions relief and whatever money in their frozen assets that may arise out of part of this overall deal, it'll be a bit easier for the Islamic Republic to actually endure, and that's what is keeping many people here awake at night. That Trump will actually go for that kind of deal just to end this, and with that, many people's hopes of regime change.
Indeed,
you're smiling. You want to remain up diplomatic.
No, I think that is if I were in Israel, I agree that is the view. I don't think it's necessarily shared by everyone, because I know that there are some other people who are worried about the nitty-gritty granularities of what are the strategic threats. It's nuclear. It's and that is the one that's always been the existential one. So having eyes on fissile material does matter and things like that. But I think you're right that if your proposition is that any deal that requires concessions only makes the Iranian regime stronger, even if it dissipates some of its most concerning threats. If that's your proposition, then sanctions relief is you're working on the assumption that maximizing this pressure over time will lead to those fissures and fractures, whereas it also could just lend to people in Iran being more miserable, but the state still having a coercive apparatus to be able to quell internal threats, right? Like that's also one outcome. It's not necessarily that you get, a manifestation of misery that leads to, a collapse of the system, but that you end up in this situation where the system still has a monopoly over the use of force, despite the fact that some of its repressive apparatus has been weakened. Right, the Israelis, in particular, one element of their air campaign in March was going not just after the military, the missile sites and the naval facilities and the nuclear facilities, but going after up and down the spine of the repressive apparatus. Right, so going from the head of the Basij down to like local level checkpoints. So, I said it before, and I think it's worth reiterating. I think the challenge for the Iranian system comes at the end of this war. If it gets that far, right, if we come to some kind of resolution, it hasn't fundamentally been able to, all it's done is defer some of these challenges. It's never really tried to address them. The January 2026 protests were just repressed by brute force. That doesn't mean that, people are no longer angry. It just means that they're not out in the streets getting shot to express that frustration. And while a war is happening, there are additional reasons not to mobilize en masse. But the system has these challenges that it faces at home that compound. And this new leadership doesn't necessarily seem more inclined to open political space. If anything, it looks set to do the opposite, because it has the harder liners calling some of the shots. Maybe it's able to get some economic reprieve, but in the past, even when Iran has had sanctions relief, there have also been protests, because it's not just money comes in, there's also corruption and mismanagement, and you're working off of a very, very poor base of development where infrastructure has been destroyed, and what hasn't been destroyed wasn't working that well in the first place. But yeah, if your end game is President Trump, and that end game appears to for him seems to be some kind of deal that has some kind of satisfactory nuclear element and some kind of addressing of Hormuz, and ends this, then you're debating over the terms. But if your point of view is that any deal, regardless of how strong its non-proliferation provisions are, or how quickly it reopens traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, or even how much it restricts the use of assets, right? Like some of the Iranian assets that are in Qatar, for example, when they were transferred, they were set up under a mechanism that would only allow for humanitarian trade, right? So if, those are already restricted funds, and they were never actually dispersed, because after the 7th of October 2023, the Biden administration said, the Iranians can't have any of these assets. But, so those are assets that would be limited in one scenario for Iran to buy food and drugs and medicine. But then you can make an argument that, but if they save that money, then they can use that money for other things.
Fungible.
And it's fungible. So if that's your starting position, unless Iran basically is no longer the Islamic Republic, any degree of relief only buys it time. Conversely, not giving that relief doesn't mean that its fall or demise is hastened. It may exacerbate the challenges it faces, but that doesn't necessarily take it from a failing system of government to a neatly replaced system of state.
That all makes sense. And I'll say it once again, this would all have been a neater conversation or a simpler conversation if it wasn't for one big matzo ball still hanging out there, which is the Strait of Hormuz, right? Which is the major leverage that the Iranians have over everyone globally.
I mean, yes and no, in the sense that if it were that easy, we would have negotiated it before the June war or negotiated in the February negotiations, right? Like now Iran does come to the table with one thing that it did not have before, which is Hormuz. It also comes in with a knowledge that its infrastructure could be destroyed, and a multi-decade setback to its system, to the nation.
Yeah. No. This is very interesting. I'm arguing on behalf of the Iranians. You're arguing on behalf of Bibi Netanyahu. So this is, I think, a good play. I'm kidding, but only slightly. But I think this is a go ahead.
Look, I think there's enough reason for everyone, or elements within like all three players in this three-body problem of Israel, the United States, and Iran, to want to see some kind of resolution to this, however you define its terms. And there are also going to be constituencies who believe that it's always one more push that gets you the victory you've been anticipating. In the case of the U.S. or Israel, it's one more set of sanctions, it's one more set of strikes, and then either
one more war,
the regime implodes, or one more war. And on the Iranian side, it's if the midterms are coming up and the U.S. is dealing with gas prices that are elevated, or another couple of attacks at the Gulf will get them to push Trump to kind of concede on some of those terms. There's always an element of, we're so close to getting everything, we just need to push a little bit more. And that exists as much on the Iranian side as it does everywhere else. And conversely, everyone's, of the same, I think, view that, if we get enough of what we want, we can live with it. But it's getting that kind of Venn diagram of what they actually want aligned. And again, based on the reporting, they're not crazy far apart on some of these things, but they're also, unless you actually get there. And even we've seen this with like the discussion over, was Lebanon part of the ceasefire? The Pakistanis and the Iranians say yes. The Israelis and the Americans said no. And that was supposed to be something that they'd actually, figured out. So if you have that element of ambiguity over things that you think you've agreed on, just extrapolate that to how much ambiguity there is on the things you haven't.
Yeah. I mean, the Lebanon, I think I've reported it, who remembers at this point, but yes, it was originally in the deal. Israel, Bibi Netanyahu protested. Trump took it out of the deal. Israel continued its offensive, especially in Beirut, last week, for a few more days. And then the Iranians and the other mediators protested to Trump, and then Trump backtracked and made Netanyahu stop in Lebanon. So again, yet another concession by Trump to the Iranians. I think it's true that he is looking for a deal. I think it's a question of whether they can get the terms.
Maybe by the time this comes out, they will have, and maybe they will, and we're back to a full-scale series of offensives.
Yeah, I think we can both agree, as can our listeners and viewers, that the coming days will be quite interesting. Naysan, thank you so much for coming on once again and to break it all down for us, regardless of what happens. And it's sporting of you to come on just a day after the major defeat between by Manchester City of Arsenal in the Premier League football league race, I suppose you would call it in American terms. So very sporting of you to come out today.
Yeah, I'm sure that's meant with absolute sincerity. But thank you nonetheless. I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. If you're a pessimist in this line of work, you'll never be disappointed, and that applies equally to the Arsenal Football Club as it does to U.S.-Iran diplomacy.
Well, I do mean this when I say best of luck, both on the pitches of English Association football and the negotiating tables of the Middle East. Thanks, Naysan.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks again to Naysan Rafati for his generous time and insights. Also, a special thanks to our producer, Jacob Gilman, our editor, Tracy Levy, and our assistant producer, Eden Jesselson, as always, and to all of you who support Israel Policy Forum's work. Do consider making a donation to Israel Policy Forum, so keeping a credible source of analysis and ideas on issues such as these that we all care deeply about, including this podcast. And most importantly, thank you for listening. Please subscribe and spread the word. And yes, Chag Sameach and happy birthday, Israel.